The name of this curriculum is Energy Reworks. And what it is actually, back in 2009, 2010, our organization worked with teachers all over the state of Michigan and energy professionals all over the state to create a program called Energy Works. And it was a K through 12 program about energy. And what I was tasked with 2 years ago was to take that curriculum and to turn it into something that's updated and relevant for today's situation. And so what we did was I worked really closely with the state of Michigan's energy department and had some support from the Mott Foundation and Consumers Energy and the Worthington Family Foundation, both technical expertise as well as funding support to put this curriculum together. And what we developed was a program that is really intended for both science and social studies classrooms. So some of the activities in this lesson plan are more science focused, and then others are more social studies focused, although there's a lot of overlap. And my goal today in this next hour is to make sure you will leave here with a copy of the Energy Rework curriculum, an electronic copy. And to that end, I'm going to ask you to go into chat and just type in your email. And it'd be cool to know what school district you work with as well, just to have a sense about where the curriculum's ending up. But this curriculum was designed specifically for Michigan. The case studies and stuff are all Michigan focused. And so you'll get a copy of the lesson plan, all the electronic resources that are tied to it. And I'm going to be going through the lesson plan so you can see what's in it, see some recommendations about how it can be connecting with your standards. And I also will going to go into a little bit of detail about how Michigan's current system is set up so that you can better identify maybe some of the ways that you could use it in your classroom. Sorry, I'm going to admit someone. Welcome. I was just mentioning that we just had a new member join us. I just was mentioning that it'd be great if you put your email contact in the chat because I can make sure that you get an electronic copy of the lesson plan that I'm going to be reviewing today. After this presentation, I'll send you a link to access it. Okay, so let me kind of get into it. So the way this program is designed is it can be used like beginning to end as a whole kind of project-based, place-based unit. So you can kind of use the lesson plans in order. And if you do, then it's all bound around the driving question of how can your school contribute to a healthier and more sustainable energy system. Now, that said, there's way more in here than probably anybody could do in a school year in terms of content to cover with kids. And so the way that each lesson is designed is you can pull it out and you can use it independent of all the rest of it. So you can use it to supplement a particular topic you're talking about in class if you see some particular activities that would supplement it, or you can think about using lessons in tandem with one another. So that's entirely up to you. It's useful either way. So just moving this out of the way. Okay, so the first unit is all about, we call it presenting the issue. And we kind of started from the perspective that you can't really identify how to improve something if you don't actually understand what it's like in the first place, right? So a lot of people really aren't very aware of how the system is actually structured and how decisions are actually made and what policies actually exist and that sort of thing. I want to say that when we got into this, we realized how huge the area of energy is. And what we did in order to be able to get into some depth on topics with students was that we actually ended up focusing on the electricity system. So you get into a lot of other things tied to energy, like energy writ bigger by doing that. But it helped us to focus and to kind of have a consistent thread through all the lessons by bringing it back always to our electricity system and understanding that system. So, so that first unit is about basically setting up the driving question and getting that background content knowledge of what is actually going on now currently in our society. And then unit 2, in the same way as like understanding kind of what's going on in our society is important. Also, if you want to identify how your school could improve, you have to understand what's going on at your school. So unit 2 is really digging into like, how can we evaluate how our school is currently intersecting with the energy system? Like, how are we using energy? What role are we playing one way or the other, right? So, and then unit 3 is set up so that if students have, if you're using this as a bigger thing and students have identified some problems and they want to delve into projects, these are all individual workshops that give you the opportunity to delve into greater detail with students. And you might find, I'm going to go through some of these in greater detail. So you might find that you know, this is an area where going in and plucking something out might be really useful for when you're teaching economics, for instance, with your students. So to give you an idea of the scope here, students have identified these kinds of issues when they've worked with the curriculum before, you know, everything from connecting the fossil fuel burning to climate change and health risks, you know, associated with the way that our energy system, to like technical kind of things, like we have this aging infrastructure and like, you know, how that's causing problems, or the equity issues that are associated with how electricity pricing is managed and things like that. There's our program lessons about that. And also kind of getting at the idea of, you know, in a more positive sense, you know, that there's a lot of opportunities in the world of energy and electricity and stuff like that in thinking about our future economy and that sort of thing. How this connects with the standards is that this was designed as a secondary curriculum. The scope of how things are written is middle and high school, depending on the students you're working with. There's definitely some differentiation in some of the lessons, and there's going to be some that you'll feel like are more tailored to a little bit younger audience, and some that are a little bit more sophisticated in what they're asking students to do. What ended up happening when we got into the standards and connecting it was we found that a lot of the 6th grade standards tend to, in the social studies, tend to be connecting with the topic, the content here, and the skills. And then at the high school level, a lot of it was around the economics and the civics standards. And along with the lesson plan, another thing you're going to get, and I just realized that this spreadsheet is for the science, sorry. We have a matrix like this for social studies too. So you have standards listed down the side, and then you have the units and the lessons across the top numbered. And basically we've identified where we see connections. It's entirely possible that you will see different connections or additional connections given your probably depth of knowledge of the subject matter. But the way to read this is that if something was really on point, like the lesson was just hitting that standard spot on, what we did was we put a star. And then if we felt like it was actually related or helping to kind of build skills towards that standard, but might have not been exactly what was kind of meant by that standard, we would put a check. So, you know, we saw a relationship there, but it wasn't necessarily spot on. So this is just a guide to help you to identify if you're looking through the curriculum. The way the curriculum is laid out is we have a summary at the beginning of every lesson plan, some objectives laid out, the materials that are included in, and it will tell you like if there's specific handouts or if you need to have some outside materials. There's not a whole lot of outside materials. It's mostly all included. There's usually a background section for teachers. And if there's any teacher preparation, sometimes there's supplemental documents to give you additional knowledge or background on the topic, or an electronic resource that's intended for teacher use. And then there's usually multiple activities in a lesson. Now, the lessons can be pulled out and used willy-nilly however you want, but you have to be a little bit careful about pulling an activity out because some of the activities within a lesson build on each other. So you just want to be careful about that. It can be done, but you need to look to see whether that's what's going on. And then, there'll be time estimates. And again, that might depend a little bit on the age you're working with. And sometimes we've erred on the caution of providing more scaffolding, which might not be needed as much for some of the older students. There will also be mentioning things like if there's electronic resources linked to this and that sort of thing. There might be references to websites to go to for further information, or that as part of the activity, that sort of thing, videos. And that's all in there. You'll find that when you look at the curriculum, a lot of the activity formats are kind of familiar, small group discussions, is a stakeholder role play, or having writing prompts, or looking at current events and, analyzing them, or a debate. There's a couple activities with debates in them, things like that, or games. So the formats are not, so novel. What you'll find that's different is the content. One of the things that we really tried to do with this is we found that there's a lot of energy and electricity lessons out there. I mean, there's a lot of people that are recognizing the importance of this as content for students to be learning. And so there's a lot of kind of opportunities to find good material out there. And when we saw that something was already there that was really substantive and good, we actually provide some links to that in the background information for teachers, and instead, or additional resources. And instead, what we did with our lessons was we focused on thinking about how can we frame this topic in a new way for students, or so that you're exploring it in a really different kind of way, or looking at the issue, or bringing some issues into the forefront for learning that aren't often given as much kind of airtime in our curriculum, which, for example, understanding how local decision-making goes around some of these issues, it would be an example of that. Okay, let me give you a little bit more detail about some of the actual lessons. In Unit 1, just to remind you, it's about what are we currently living with as a system. And so the very first lesson is kind of like, let's look at our driving question about how we can create a healthier and more sustainable system. And then what do we mean by healthy? What do we mean by sustainable? What do we mean by energy? Like kind of exploring the definition of those terms and stuff like that. So that's the first lesson. The second lesson is actually delving more into looking critically at how we use language in our culture to try and raise up awareness that sometimes the barriers to change, or the things that affect how we see the world and stuff like that, are not just technical barriers. They're not just, we haven't invented it yet or something like that. Sometimes it's just the ideas that we have in our head about the way the world are can end up leading us to go only looking tunnel vision in this direction and not over here, and that sort of thing, or lend themselves to us falling into different camps and ending up, butting heads with each other. And the fundamental thing is that maybe underneath, we're basically defining things differently, or basically using language in a different way. And so there's activities like trying to connect quotes with sources, or trying to group, different, here's these 5 quotes and these, and what's kind of common about what these folks are saying. Like, what are the underlying concepts that are driving the words that we're seeing, you know? Or even thinking about word associations, like this activity down at the bottom, you know, what do you associate with fossil fuels versus renewable energies? Where do those ideas come from? Like, why do you have, you know, the one, you know, kind of getting reflective about that. And then the lesson 3 is really one that gets into the nitty gritty of like, how is the system set up? Like physically, structurally, and then also, you know, in terms of who manages it, who makes decisions about it, how are decisions made, who's responsible for what in the system. And so let me just, if we were in person right now, I would have handed you a deck of cards, these cards, and had you sit down and like work with a partner or something like that and try to sort them and see like, how do you think that these things lay out? What do you think the sequence of how our system is built structurally, right? How is it laid out? And then we talk through it with some different dimensions. I'm going to go to a different slide here, this one, which shows a couple of different dimensions of the system. So it's got the same information as the cards, but it kind of shows some things more clearly. If you look at the area where the orange and the green are, we have that our system starts with, we have to have a source of energy somewhere, right? The orange part is the non-renewable sources of energy, and that is 92% of what is feeding Michigan's system right now. We only have 8% being taken care of by renewables in our state. And the majority really is coal. That's, it's still coal, even though there's been changes, that's still the case. So those largely fossil fuels are burned in power plants to generate electricity. And the way that that actually works is that they burn the fuel in order to heat water, and then that water turns into steam. That steam rotates giant turbines, and that turbine then creates a magnetic field that generates electricity. And so we have alternating current then shooting out across these transmission lines at incredibly high voltage. Sorry, I set a timer for myself so I would stay on task. And what we have happening is this incredibly high voltage is going out on these transmission lines. And then it goes through, and they do that because electricity moves more efficiently at high voltage. And so it can go further distances. So as it gets closer to where it needs to be used, like an end user, which are the things in blue here on this picture, it has to go through transmission substations to like step down that energy. So you can actually look at the types of poles, tell you what kind of voltage is going on. So there's all these different, you know, if you go and Google this, you'll see all sorts of different kinds of transmission lines, and you'll see that it's actually associated with certain kinds of voltages. So they step down, and you have industry or factories that need really high voltage for certain kinds of processes. So they might get pulled, they might come off of higher voltage lines. But then eventually, when it's going into residential users areas, it goes into what's called distribution lines. So they're given a different name, and that's carrying much lower voltage electricity. And that is transformed, like there's these little pole transformers that then convert it down to a voltage that can enter your home. And then once it gets into our home, we either use 120 volts to power our TV and stuff like that, or with our water heater or AC, it might be 240 volts. So we have this system set up, and it's called a centralized system. Now, when you introduce solar or wind and stuff, one of the things that can do is it can introduce a decentralized system, or what's called a distributed system, which doesn't have to go through like traveling this long distance. But another thing to know about the system and how it's set up is the color coding on here. So with the yellow area, what Michigan is on is the Eastern Transmission System. So we are on the system that goes into Canada, it goes into all the northeastern states and stuff, like, so the Eastern Seaboard, basically, we're all on the same electricity grid with a lot of other states. And so the Federal Energy Commission, there is an administrative body that actually, government agency that oversees how this is managed. But it's actually physically managed by private companies. They're called RTO, Regional Transmission Officers. So there's these private companies that are kind of like the air traffic controllers of our system, and they like decide who's on what wires and how much electricity is going over this wire or that wire and stuff like that. And there's this federal agency that kind of oversees that and makes sure that they don't charge too much, for the use of their electricity lines and stuff like that. In the red zone, what we have are the utility companies that we're familiar with. So they're in charge of the power plants. They run the power plants or own them. And they're also responsible for those distribution lines that end up taking electricity around our neighborhoods, that lower voltage, and cutting the trees back if they're going to take down poles and stuff like that. So they're kind of at either end of the system in a way. And they are private entities as well that create contracts with the RTOs. Like, so the private entities in the red zone are contracting with the private entities in the yellow zone in a market-based kind of system to get time on the lines, to get their energy from their power plant out onto the lines and feeding into the neighborhoods that they're responsible for, right? So, and they have to bid for it and all this stuff. But at the red level, at the state level, there's also the Michigan Public Service Commission, which is a state agency that is a government agency that oversees this. So that regulates how much, for instance, your utility company can charge you for electricity per kilowatt hour and that kind of thing. So here in Michigan, in this Eastern Transmission System, we have a system that is really a public-private hybrid kind of system. But not all electricity is run this way. And actually, the case of what happened in Texas, and where we see, they didn't weatherize well, for cold weather. And so then there's all these issues with their system. They have isolated their system and it's entirely market-based. There's no government oversight to how utilities and stuff are functioning within Texas to provide the electricity. And one of the consequences of that we see is that the utility companies, when they suffered losses, they just pass that on to their customers. And now we've got news reports of like, oh my gosh, there's like all this, like people have $16,000 energy bills when it should have been like $200 or something like that, right? So like a shocking difference. And that would never happen in Michigan simply because the utility companies have to go through a big rigmarole actually to make any kind of adjustment to how much we have to pay. It's a very good example. In some of the standards, there's like thinking about the way in which our government interacts with the private sector and our market-based economy and stuff. This is a really good example with the system of how that happens. So there's a lot more that could be said about this system, but I don't want to take too much of our time on that. If you do have questions, it'd be great. Let me know. Have you been putting stuff in the chat? Maybe I should check. Sorry. I'm not very good at monitoring the chat when I'm talking. Oh, there. Can you talk about the Texas situation? I'm glad I did. So really what caused the problem with the Texas situation is that they weren't weatherized for winter weather. And they were also on this separate system. Like there's a lot of redundancy in our system, and that redundancy, like the complexity of our network, our Eastern Transmission System can cause problems. Like the centralization of electricity can cause certain kinds of problems, but the isolation can cause other kinds of problems. And so that's actually something that can be explored a little bit with some of the materials that are in here. It's kind of the pros and cons. It's not like there's one panacea answer. Probably a mixture of having both of those things would be the most stable kind of system to be having. All right, lesson 4. This is a fun one. Students seem to really enjoy it. It's a role play scenario where basically, due to climate change kind of issues that have gone on in the community, there's certain sorts of stuff happening in a community. So it's a hypothetical scenario in Green City, there's this issue going on, and groups of up to 7 students can role play it together. They're given a budget, they're given a character sheet that tells you this is who you are in the community, and this is what your interests are, and that sort of thing. And they go off and they prepare, and they're given some templates to help them prepare and stuff. And then they come back to the table and they like negotiate how, and the mayor basically has invited these stakeholders to come to the table and help advise the mayor on how to spend this $5 million of emergency funds that have been given to the end. And it's, people from hospital folks to, electricians union people to thinking about, the CEO of the utility company that services, so how all these different agencies, social justice organization is one of the folks that's there. So this is a cool activity for getting at the idea that it's a really complicated thing to come up with policy and to make these decisions. It's not simple, and people's perspectives are genuine and grounded in real serious interests, but yet also practicing that, coming to the table, compromising, hearing each other out, trying to empathize for somebody else's perspective. All of that kind of stuff is built into how you can run this activity with students. So very important in today's, given today's social context. The last lesson is really kind of a setup if you wanted to use this for building student projects and stuff like that. And that is, it's just kind of a framework for helping them define what is it that you have questions about, what is it that you're interested in, thinking about, you have questions about the function, are they equity issues, are there health issues, what's kind of jumping out at you about these different things. And also thinking about the fact that realizing that people have very different ideas about our future, and that's there to prompt them to think about and how are you reacting to these different ideas about our future and stuff like that. Where are you sitting in that right now? Okay, let me just check the chats real quick. Oh, windmills. Oh, what happened with windmills in Texas? One of the things, they can be weatherized too, and they weren't. We have windmills. There are windmills in Alaska. There are windmills in Canada and stuff, and here in Michigan that work just fine in the winter. And there's things you can do about the way they're designed. And they weren't designed to withstand cold temperatures. They weren't insulated properly and stuff like that. So they actually stopped turning, and froze. So that's what happened in Texas. And so any of the sources of electricity can end up becoming a problem, if they're not built for the environment that they're in. Sorry, somebody was asking a question about windmills on the chat. Okay. All right. So this unit 2 was how can we make energy improvements? This is some activities around thinking about what's going on in your school and how can you kind of assess that. They tend to be a little bit more sciencey, but you might be interested. So I'll just really quickly point out what this is. So their Energy Star is an EPA run program that your school can participate in, which will actually give your school a rating about how you do energy-wise. And it can be a foundation for establishing like school-wide plans for growth and change and stuff like that, or with a class. And so there's some articles or some activities in here like saying, what is benchmarking? Because it uses that idea. That's how Energy Star works, is like it benchmarks your school against others that are of the same size and in the same kind of climate and stuff like that, and how well is it using its energy, right, for its size and everything. There's some activities around like how do you read a utility bill, these kinds of things. So like really kind of basic skill stuff. But you need to get data off of those, your utility bills at the school and stuff to be able to participate in this benchmarking thing. And basically, if you get over a 75% or a Energy Star rating of 75%, then you're like an Energy Star school, and it can be a status for your school. So it's something to consider there. You can sometimes get administrators interested in participating in or supporting this kind of an activity with your students, because it can speak well to your school. And this is just there. This is all in the lesson plan, but you go into Energy Star, you complete some information in Portfolio Manager. I'm not going to get into it now because the lesson plan really does walk you through it step by step. And if you were ever having problems with it, you could always contact me, and I'd be happy to provide support in that. The next lesson plan is, like this benchmarking will give you a sense about how your school's using energy. But if you get a poor rating or you get a good rating, like understanding why you got the rating you got actually requires a deeper dive look, and it's called an energy audit. And so there's some energy audit activities. There's like doing one with your classroom with lots of scaffolding kind of for younger students. And there's a more open-ended version of that you can do with older students. And I'm not going to get into that. It's pretty self-explanatory in the lesson plan, and it tends to fit better with science standards. So Unit 3 is basically a smorgasbord of workshops in all these different areas. So some of them, for example, are really getting in nitty-gritty about solar energy and how solar energy works and what it is and the technology of it and all of that kind of stuff, and labs about that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out the ones that are social studies related and review them real quickly, because we're already getting short on time. All right, Unit 3, Lesson 1 is about energy policy. So there's a PowerPoint slideshow that's like introducing the whole idea of policy in the first place. What is social policy? And then it introduces these ideas that I mentioned before about the Michigan Public Service Commission and what utility companies have to do if they want to change the rate that they're charging. They have to do a thing called a rate case, and there's a whole process there. And there's cards for students to like sort through and figure out what is that process. There's a mock, like there's a hypothetical one where again students can take on stakeholder roles and do a little mock rate case, kind of like a mock trial kind of thing, only with this kind of setting. And there's quite a bit of content in here for teachers to provide background on the history of the energy system in Michigan and kind of how it got to this point and why we have the Public Service Commission and stuff like that. The second lesson is on economics. And so definitely links up with standards around like getting at our market-based economy, supply and demand. What does that actually mean in the context of energy and how our energy system works? And it's really it's kind of interesting and complicated from the standpoint of like electricity is something that we can't really effectively store. It's in this centralized system. That's not the approach that's taken. We don't try to store our energy. What we do is we try to make predictions about how the usage is, and we try to generate to meet like anticipated needs and stuff like that. But that's one of the reasons why we end up with with massive blackouts sometimes and stuff like that. Because when things happen that where that supply and demand don't align, then it can have really serious consequences. Like it can have serious consequences economically, but it also, for people's lives, everyday lives, and that sort of thing. So there's some activities in here about like understanding, like figuring out like the cost and benefit to like building windmills versus solar versus like a natural gas generator power plant versus a coal. Like how much do you have to invest capital in that, versus like how much does it cost to run it on a day-to-day basis or maintain it, and I'm thinking about the trade-offs there in how we economically invest as a community in these things and that sort of thing. And I just want to say that we're an environmental organization, so there is a tendency to push towards like thinking about new and innovative and different ways of thinking about it than just the way it is right now. At the same time, there's a lot of open-endedness in here for folks to look at the data and to come to genuinely different conclusions about things. Like we're not trying to pigeonhole like there's one answer to this because they're complicated. The third lesson is around energy access. We called it energy justice at one point. This is really using case study approaches to like looking at research and looking at like newspaper articles about communities and stuff like that that are facing different sorts of social difficulties around cost, around access to resources. And this also connects it a little bit to things like, what is really the danger of getting your electricity shut off? Like, so kind of making the connection that like, it's not just that you lose your electricity so you can't charge your iPhone or whatever. It's that like now your food spoils in your fridge and you can't use water. You can't get access to water because the water pumps require electricity and you don't have heat now, and what if you have a medical condition that requires you to have some equipment that's electrically charged, then your health is at risk and all of these sorts of things, right? Like, so it's a much more complicated connection. So when we think about people's well-being and stuff, we use the context. I just want to emphasize that there's a lot of like, so this claim's being made, where's the evidence in what you read, or what is the author using as evidence for like actually coming to this conclusion or making this claim or that sort of thing. I'm sorry, I'm trying to get my alarm. Okay, so there's a lot of again, this is one that uses scientific research, it's kind of translated into a form that's age appropriate, but and using newspaper articles and stuff like that, but it's asking you to analyze the text, to use evidence from the text or the data tables or something to support whatever it is that you're going to be saying. A lot of pushing students to think in that way about these issues. Lesson 4, the energy access gets at health connections, and then with lesson 4, it's called the public health one. It's kind of a different approach to that. It's where students actually work in groups to design the layout of a community and like where are you going to position different places in the community and stuff like that. And then the community experiences a series of climate-related incidents. And then like, what's the consequence then for the people, like looking at it from a health perspective and welfare perspective. And then like, how would you readjust your community to respond to this, or to maybe it's kind of a climate adaptation focused lesson. Lesson 5, keeping the system running. If you are working with students and you really want to get into like, well, what kind of jobs are, like who is it that keeps this system running, and like what's the diversity of jobs that you can do in this field. And also there's a whole activity in here about OSHA and like understanding, that this kind of getting at the idea that like, we take electricity really for granted in a lot of ways, like we expect it to be there and stuff like that, but like actually understanding all the human effort and risk in a lot of cases and stuff like that that goes into, I mean, these jobs are difficult that people have to do to actually make our electricity system work, right? You know, from the engineers that are designing things and like dealing with really complex, you know, technical challenges and stuff like that, to the people that are dealing with the social challenges tied to it, you know, to the people that are like trimming your trees and the kinds of hazards that they, you know, face on a daily basis and stuff. So kind of helping students kind of appreciate it or get a look at it from that perspective. Lesson 8, our way to introduce students to the different renewable technologies was to set it up as a debate format. So there's a series of paired debates, and you have different teams of students, like, so one's going off and looking at geothermal and others at solar, another at natural gas, you know, and stuff. And then they have head-to-head, you know, paired debates, and, you know, there's a whole set of materials in here for, you know, students to like then rank how people did in the debates and give feedback and that sort of thing. This entire curriculum, if you were to actually print it out, is over 700 pages. And a big chunk of it is that we went through and curated basically lots of materials for these debates. I think 80 pages of it is like information packets, you know, on solar, on wind, on geothermal and stuff. And, you know, you wouldn't necessarily give all of that to students, but it's to give you, so you don't have to go and find it, and you don't have to give students a huge research project. What you can do is you can give them some articles, you know, and we feel like it's pretty well balanced in terms of its presentation. Like, I mean, there's opportunities there to find information that both, you know, helps you to build a case for and to challenge it, you know, for all of the different resources. So this is a nice way to introduce students to the variety of like alternatives to our current dependence on fossil fuels. And then the last lesson that I'll mention is lesson 12, and it's about transitioning to renewables. So it's really thinking about what are, you know, if we're going to make this move culturally away from fossil fuels towards renewables, what's that really take? And so again, it's kind of taking a case study approach where students as a whole group, the way the lesson is structured is students as a whole group first look at the case study of an Alaskan community that has, and it's a newspaper article that's describing, you know, what they've gone through to make a transition to, you know, relying largely on wind. And what the questions are about is like, what did they need to do? Like what was involved in making the transition? What can you find in this article? And what were the kind of conditions that this community was facing that led them to make this decision? Like kind of what are the externalities around a situation like this that's going to make it the decision that a community makes to go in that direction, right? And then there's a set of three or four like little video case studies, which are talking about other kind of community examples of situations where people have decided to go off the grid in some way or try to introduce renewables as a greater proportion of their energy source and stuff. And it's kind of having students go back again, you can have them break up into groups or whatever, and look at different examples and think about like, is there consistency across these examples of like, what are the kinds of conditions that like push society in this direction? You know, like for instance, they might identify it's astronomically high electricity prices, like push people to like saying we need an alternative, for example, or maybe being in remote places that don't have easy access to the grid, like so like that it's just physically difficult to connect to the system that exists, and so it's easier to think about this other alternative. So there's these kinds of things that are going on in situations that help move things in that direction. So then thinking about what does that mean for us as a larger society? What's the likelihood that we're going to move this direction? You know, you can kind of do a persuasive paper out of it and that sort of thing, students. So these are the types of materials that you'll find in this lesson plan. Hopefully something will catch your eye and you'll be interested in. If you do, it'd be cool to know. Feel free to email me anytime with questions. Here's my contact, education@ecocenter.org. And I didn't leave any question time. I'm terrible. Okay, I'm like the worst at balancing my time. Yes, you definitely can send the lessons to other teachers in your school. I would be happy. My goal is to just get it out there to as many people as possible. It'd be good to know, like it's good feedback for us to know, like, is this getting out to a school district, or, you know, X number of teachers have, you know, seen this lesson and that sort of thing. So if you can provide that kind of feedback, I'd appreciate it. How would we know if our school is always participating? Okay, I'm not sure that I understand the question. It's okay to unmute yourself if you want to ask me. You meant to say, oh, is already has this curriculum? That is a good question. I think this is the first time that I've spoken with social studies teachers about it. So I have done several presentations with science teachers. So what I would say is I would check in with the staff, the science staff. What will happen, like when it comes to like the benchmarking or energy audit type stuff, or the Energy Star stuff, if that's what you're referring to, that is something that your facilities folks, like your facility director, would have to have been looped in to that, because they're the only people that can provide certain kinds of information. So they would know if your school district is in any way connected with that. But with the curriculum, you're going to have to reach out to individual teachers in your district. Are you asking from the standpoint of, I'm just not sure if I'm understanding. Sorry. If I haven't answered your question, I have to get off, okay? But if I haven't answered your question clearly and you're not sure, shoot me an email at education@ecocenter.org. And I'll definitely communicate with you. All right, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it.